go. Okay. All right. We're going to do our fifth installment. We're halfway through this. As I said in my email, I did this just to make sure everybody knew what an amazing record we have, and we're even having a debate whether I missed one. So it's kind of a astounding record. But I should have also realized these are going to be fantastic talks. We have some of the best researchers and best lecturers around. And so I'll say this again. So today's going to be in 306 Soda, all right? Where the across the street is tied up, and 306 Soda is smaller than the one across the street. We do have an overflow room nearby, but get here. And as I'll say, I think Dick Karp is plausibly the most famous computer scientist in the world. I think I think that's plausible. But I'm going to talk about the beginning. So were you born in Boston or grew up in Boston?
I grew up in Boston, in Dorchester.
Dorchester, which is a suburb, right?
Which is
or
in the city.
In the city, okay.
In the city. And my parents told me that I didn't have to wash the dishes if I got A's.
Oh.
So I was a good little schoolboy and did what they wanted. And then they told me that I should go to Harvard. And I didn't bother applying. I applied for MIT as my escape hatch.
So all the way to Cambridge, right?
Yeah. But I got into Harvard, which was good for me because the courses at MIT are much tougher.
Well, you went to Boston Latin, which I, as a West Coast guy, I didn't even know what that is. It's older than Harvard.
No, it's younger than Harvard by 1 year.
It's younger by 1 year. Okay. Yeah. And Benjamin Franklin went there, and.
But he didn't manage to graduate, and I did.
So Benjamin Franklin's a dropout from Boston Latin.
Right.
So did that experience shape you in high school in some way?
Well, there weren't any girls, so that had its effect.
Yes.
But there were some great things there. I took 6 years of Latin. And I enjoyed it enormously and never regretted it. People sort of make fun of me when I talk about that.
Uh-huh.
And I had a great math teacher who helped me very much. And there were some mediocre teachers too, but it was a pretty good training. Yeah.
And you've got 3 siblings, I know, and
Right.
they all have graduate degrees. Is that right?
Yeah, my sister has 3 master's degrees.
3.
And she is a college teacher, local college, teaches English and corrects my grammar. She's 69 years old. My brother Robert I'm the oldest, 83.
Uh-huh.
Robert had a successful career in real estate, traveling around the country.
Traveling around the country. Yeah.
Negotiating.
So kind of a traveling salesman, is that what you?
I never thought about that. He was a good wheeler dealer, putting up housing projects here and there on golf courses. And David is 74, and he became a sociologist. And he was afflicted and still is with depression.
Oh.
And he made that the theme of his research.
Wow.
So he's written 3 books on depression, taking advantage of his own experiences. The first one was about the experience of having depression. The second one was the family effects. And the third one was called Is It Me or My Meds? And it's all about how taking psychoactive drugs sort of changes your self-image and how you think about things.
So pretty successful set of siblings. So were your parents, what about their education and things?
My father graduated from Harvard. He wanted to go to medical school but couldn't afford to. And he ended up becoming a public school teacher. And in fact, I think that was a major influence on me because I had a particularly favorable impression of him when I went to his school. That was a big treat. And he was a very good teacher. He could draw circles freehand, perfect circles freehand.
Wow.
So I've never found a use for that myself.
But an impressive skill. Yeah.
Yeah, and my mother was very bright, but she grew up in an age when women typically didn't go to college.
Right.
So she finished high school, and then in her 50s, she got an adjunct degree from Harvard.
Wow.
And that was the biggest moment of her life. She graduated and was interviewed on TV and all that sort of thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and I remember you saying, telling me a long time ago that you grew up a Boston Red Sox fans, and it was,
Wow, yes.
and that
It's a good year for the Red Sox.
yes. For those who don't follow sports, the Red Sox were famous for not winning the World Series until they won it about 15 years ago, and they've won it 3 times, and they're in the World Series now, and they won the first game
Right.
tonight. And then, so did the baseball statistics get you hooked on math? Is that
Oh, definitely. That was my introduction to statistics and operations research. When I was about 10 years old, I got very interested in baseball and spent a lot of time thinking about when you should bunt and when you should hit away.
Oh, really?
And, all that sort of thing.
So
when you replace the pitcher.
So the analytics, you were early in the baseball analytics movement. Huh?
Well, I didn't have a big database, but I had my opinions.
Yes. So you'd be in there keeping score on the scorecards, and the manager screwed up. He didn't have him bunt.
Something like that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So you, I guess since your dad went to Harvard and you're in the Boston Latin, you had to go to Harvard. But that was pre-computer science. So.
Oh, way before.
Yeah. So what did you?
So I started it at Harvard in 1951, and I was a math major and took a wide variety of other things. I wasn't a very hard worker in college, I must say. So I did well in math up to a point, but then when I got to the more advanced graduate courses toward the end of my undergraduate days, I was really outclassed by some of the people and some of the students in the class. One of them was David Mumford, who won the Fields Medal.
Wow.
And another one was Ken Wilson, who I believe had the Nobel Prize in physics. But not then. And there was another guy who was even more prodigious than they were. And he had a decent career in mathematics as well.
Wow, that's stiff competition. So, but you went to grad school. Would your parents want you to go to grad school, or?
They left it to me, but my mother whispered in my ear that data processing was going to be the next big thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Like the graduate, like plastic.
Right, exactly. The wave of the future.
Wow.
And
That's pretty smart.
Yeah. And since
That's 1955. She whispers in your ear.
Right. And since I liked math a lot, but I didn't want to pursue a career in pure mathematics, given the competition from the likes of Mumford and others. So I started taking courses in the computation lab, and that suited me better because I like to do very concrete things. I'd like to do little examples. I'm really more of a computing person. Well, I don't program. I do lots of hand examples.
Okay.
But I do lots of examples and play with lots of things, and so I think I'm a good match for the pursuits of computer science.
Was that I don't know Harvard well enough? Was that Aiken's lab?
That was Aiken's lab. Yes.
Does that mean? Did you know Fred Brooks when he was there?
Fred recruited me to IBM.
Oh, how about that? Fred Brooks is another Turing Award winner, but he tells stories of Aiken, and so there's in computer architecture, there's a phrase called Harvard computing. It's where you isolate the stored program from the data, and it's called Harvard because of the computers that Aiken was building in that lab, and Brooks was heavily influenced by Aiken.
Yeah, I think Aiken also resisted binary arithmetic.
You want to keep everything decimal.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask. I exactly wanted to ask you next, because after I read your biography, so you get your PhD in 1959, and then you go to IBM. Did you did you consider any other place else? Did you apply it for universities or anything?
Only to industry, because the very few universities had anything in computer science at that time, I think.
Oh, it's even too early for computer science
Yeah,
departments.
I think the Purdue department existed. I think Stanford was just getting going. MIT had enough computer science to be de facto a place with computer science, but didn't have an admission process for it. And so I didn't even think about going to a university. I interviewed at a number of companies and found IBM the most appealing. It was a very good move. It really worked well.
Yeah, so that was Yorktown Heights?
Yorktown Heights, yeah.
Yeah, so then, I mean, IBM dominated the computing industry, and Yorktown Heights was probably the leading computer science lab. Must have been, right?
Well, Bell Labs.
Bell Labs,
Yeah.
too.
I think we always had a little bit of an inferiority complex to Bell Labs.
Oh, because of the Nobel Prizes and stuff? Or?
You know, just Bell Labs had sort of an aura. The public knew more about it.
Uh-huh.
And they were good. So, but the job offer I got from Bell Labs was not very good. So I definitely wanted to go to a group that was more mathematical, and that was possible at IBM.
So that's so you go there and you're there 9 years, and then you come to Berkeley. So what was the decision? What made you leave, and did you consider other places or?
Yes, I did. The computer science departments and programs started cropping up in the mid-'60s. Mm-hmm. And just for recreation, I used to teach evening courses at Columbia, NYU, and Brooklyn Polytechnic. I found
that's pretty far from Yorktown, isn't it? I don't.
Well, there's a good restaurant down there in Brooklyn.
Okay.
So, and I found myself really enjoying it. Mm-hmm. And I felt that I had a knack for it.
Like your dad, huh?
Like my dad, yeah, that figured into this as well. And so I became sort of actively interested in teaching at a university. And I actually applied to Berkeley in 1964, just 5 years out. And they made me an offer as a beginning associate professor.
Oh.
But I couldn't quite cross the Rubicon at that point. First of all, I didn't really understand how great Berkeley was. It was just, there's Michigan and there's Berkeley.
Okay, a couple of big public schools.
Right, so, and I had a very good friend, Gene Lawler, at Michigan. And so he invited me to come for a year, and that was more comfortable because it wasn't casting my fate entirely with academia. And so I went to Ann Arbor. I also got a job.
So did you spend a year there?
I spent a year there.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And I really got into teaching. My teaching previously had been very casual. I'd sort of compose the lecture in the car on the way down to the university. But I really got into it at Michigan, and I was a perfectionist and taught automata theory and switching theory, things like that. And but IBM really was more exciting intellectually for me at that time, and so I came back. And then in 1968, Mike Harrison successfully tried to get me interested in coming to Berkeley. Mm-hmm. The 3 Ks were being recruited: Kahan, Knuth, and Karp. And
so Knuth was started at Caltech, and he had just written his book, I think.
The first volume.
The first volume. And so Mike Harrison's idea was to recruit the 3 Ks, Belleville, Kahn, Karp, and Knuth,
right.
Which seemed like a pretty perceptive recruiting plan.
Well, I couldn't compare myself to Don Knuth. He was like the universal computer scientist. But I was attracted to the situation. We had a tiny little department in the College of Letters and Science. I think Beresford, where's Beresford?
Right
there he is. My chairman, Beresford Bartlett. And Butler Lamson was a member of that department.
Another Turing Award winner.
And Jim Gray was there as a student.
He eventually got a Turing Award.
Yeah. But the idea was that the little department in the College of Letters and Science would concentrate on applications in the humanities and social sciences.
Oh.
And they tried to recruit somebody in that area, but de facto, it was just a regular computer science department. Very good group, but not different from, qualitatively, from the more experienced department in electrical engineering headed by Latvizzata. So many of you may know, or I don't know how well known it is, there was a lot of contention between the two groups, and many of them wanted to remain separate, but the administration decided that they couldn't afford to have two such similar departments. And eventually somebody orchestrated a visiting committee where the cards were stacked in favor of a merger.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and the administration acted on that. So then they had to figure out the terms of the merger, and they decided that what they would do would be to create a semi-autonomous computer science division. And
Inside of EECS.
inside of EECS. And I was the only tenured faculty member who didn't have a load of enemies, since I hadn't been there very long. And so they made me associate chair. And
that was in
73.
73.
And I had no experience on the operations of universities. I didn't realize that every faculty appointment is precious and a big deal, and it has to be, inspected from all angles, and you just can't manage to slip up. So I didn't have a clue about how to do recruiting, and in general, I was pretty raw to be serving in that role. I was saved by the fact that Tom Everhart, who later became director of Caltech, president of Caltech, understood our needs for autonomy, and he even tolerated some of my rookie mistakes because he knew that it was important for us to fly, to flap our own wings, and things worked out. Once it was a fait accompli that we were going to be merged, I think the rivalries kind of toned down. People work together, and Berkeley's been on a rising trajectory all these years since that time.
Yeah. I was, so that was 1973. 1972, you wrote a paper.
Right.
Reducibility among combinatorial problems. For modern people, if you haven't heard of it, has 13,000 citations in Google Scholar. So proved that any of 21 well-known problems, including traveling salesmen, if they could be solved, then all of them could be solved efficiently, MP complete. So you got up to 21. So you started getting these results. What'd you do? Write a paper, talk to people? What did you do?
Well, I had been working in combinatorial optimization all along. I did some work right at the beginning of my time at IBM with the traveling salesman problem, and I was attached to a group that was automating the design of logic circuits back in the days where, a gate cost $1 and you wanted to minimize the number of gates.
Yeah, IBM sold a lot of gates.
Yeah, and so I was familiar with combinatorial explosions. And then Steve Cook came along and had the insight to show that a certain problem in propositional logic was so rich in its expressibility that you could encode almost any combinatorial problem using, the format of clauses and Boolean expressions. And so using that insight and a very clever proof method, he showed that a whole class of problems were reducible to satisfiability. Satisfiability was a rich enough language to express the traveling salesman problem and cliques and coverings and packings and matchings and all the things that you do in combinatorial optimization. And he defined a certain class called NP. That stands for non-deterministic polynomial. And NP is contrasted with the class P. P is the class of problems that can be solved efficiently in polynomial time. People recognized, even back in the 60s, that a good criterion for whether the running time was favorable was whether it could be given as a polynomial in the size of the input. So n squared, n cubed, and so on. It's an imperfect measure because the polynomial is allowed to have any degree, so you can have some pretty unappealing.
Pretty slow.
But it was a good yardstick. So the focus was, it was clear that there should be a focus on polynomial versus non-polynomial. Then Koch had the insight that the difference between the problems that looked as if they were going to have inevitably combinatorial explosions as compared with the polynomial time problems like shortest path in a graph or spanning tree and so on. The difference was these other problems could still have the property that somebody could, if you wanted to know whether a graph had a clique of size 17, you might not be able to find it out in polynomial time, but there was a clue or a hint or what we call a witness that could be given, and the person given that witness could then quickly verify. So it was a dialogue between a prover and a verifier. And the verifier could quickly verify that the property existed. So there's P, the problems that are solvable in polynomial time, and NP, the problems that are checkable or verifiable in polynomial time. And those problems essentially span virtually all of the common combinatorial optimization problems. There's some technicalities. It's not exactly what I said is it's true in spirit.
Okay.
And then Koch proved that all of the problems in NP, the satisfiability problem all of the problems in NP can be expressed as satisfiability problems. That means that satisfiability is the hardest problem in the class NP. So that's where Koch left it. And he was approaching it from the perspective of a logician, and it was just a nice mathematical class to be investigating. It didn't appear from his work that he really knew that all of these problems that have these combinatorial explosions, like minimizing a switching circuit or finding the root of the traveling salesman problem, all lay in NP. Again, I'm oversimplifying. And they were all reducible to satisfiability. So satisfiability is the key problem. And it later came to be called NP complete. Because I had experience with logic design and some logistic problems and scheduling problems and so forth, it was almost self-evident to me that many of these other problems were also sufficiently rich to express everything, all of NP. And so I just sort of systematically tried to show that all of these problems were complete, able to express everything. And the key to doing that was to define a kind of reducibility notion. Basically that one problem can be reducible to another, but you can solve the first problem by mapping it to an instance of the second problem, solving the second problem, and mapping back. So I defined this notion of reducibility. Koch had a somewhat different notion. And I just systematically started doing reductions. So the first thing I did was to show that SAT could be re-expressed as a Max Clique problem. And all these other problems, the knapsack problem, graph coloring, and on and on. It was possible, and not too difficult really, to give reductions, bringing them all into the fold. So I stopped at 21, and all of those problems were then shown to be equivalent in the sense that any one of them, that if any one of them was in P, they all would be. But probably more likely, none of them are in P.
So this is a question I've asked others. At the time that you had the, I don't know, Eureka Moment, or you started working this all out, did you realize this was a really big result?
Yes, it was clear.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think, as far as I can tell in these lectures, everybody thinks when they got the result, this is a big result. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only time in my life that I really had that same feeling.
That's the only time. Yeah, wow. And your reward was being made chair of the.
Yeah, I wasn't too happy about that, but
so then
I even threatened to go to Yale, but that was but that was really an empty threat. I wasn't about to do that.
And then did you go around and give talks, or you just submitted the paper to the conference? I don't even know where it appeared.
Well, one notable computer scientist, whom I won't name, characterized me as going around the country giving talks and collecting problems to put on the list.
Oh, is that right? to get up to 21? Is that?
I got up to 21 all by myself.
All by yourself. All right. So you weren't particularly tempted by staying into math versus computer science. You were in the applied, whatever that was called, the lab at Harvard, and that seemed like home to you rather than do math.
The Harvard experience was mixed. There was a ragtag collection of courses, and so I was actually in the Division of Engineering and Applied Sciences, what's currently called the Division of Applied Science at Harvard. And so I took a little bit of control theory, a little bit of statistics, a little bit of complex analysis. I pieced something together. My biggest mistake was to take a course on timing circuits and pulse techniques, where I learned that soldering was not for me.
Which end is hot? Right?
Right. So I took a mix. I liked the probability and statistics particularly, and I got a lot of encouragement from the professors I had in that area. One particular person was the mathematician Hartley Rogers, who wrote a definitive book on computability theory, which actually was helpful to me later. Hartley had me in a course, and then I graded for him, and he made me feel respected. Whereas all those famous mathematicians who were teaching these advanced courses that I was getting B's in didn't make me feel respected.
This is while you were an undergraduate?
When I was in, yeah.
Wow. So is there any particular time when your ideas come? That's just a question I have. Is it when going for walks, taking a shower, things like, or sleep in the middle of the night? Is there
Well, I wrote something about that. I think I was probably making it up. But I would say that, and this is common knowledge, that ideas sort of pop into your head unbidden, often when you don't think you're thinking about the topic. That's a well-known cognitive effect. And yes, I've experienced that.
So I'm going to open it up for questions. But the thing of his amazing accomplishments that struck me is, I think my guess is the Turing Award seems to be having off by 1 year. It says 1985, but I won the 2017 and 2018. So I think you got the Distinguished Teaching Award, the highest award in the Berkeley campus, and the Turing Award in the same year. Is that plausible?
I don't think so. I think that they were close.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the distinguished teacher, so it seems to be, Dick was attracted by teaching to come back to the university and has won the highest awards, and not just the Turing Award. He won the National Medal of Science, which I don't think anybody else in EECS has ever won the National Medal of Science. So he's reached the top echelons of teaching and research. Okay, how about younger questioners, which are easy to find? But we need somebody with the courage to raise their hand. Okay, so.
Mm-hmm. Are you asking about computer science in particular? Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, there's more women in computer science now. Has the field changed in offer advice for women in computer science?
I think it's become more welcoming. It's broadly understood and accepted by academic administrations that it's desirable to draw women into the field, and desirable also to make sure that women faculty members are treated on the same basis as male faculty members. So that idea, which was definitely not so current a while ago, is now accepted. There's always resistance here and there, but I think that the trend is definitely in direction of equal treatment for both genders. I think, I hope I won't be called a sexist, but I would say that women tend to be motivated slightly differently. This is a dangerous generalization to make, but I'll venture to say that men are more driven by technical mechanisms, whereas women, who are quite capable of dealing with the technical side, are also very driven by societal implications. And so I think it's important to make room in the curricula for pathways for women who really want that inspiration from societal applications and even the arts and humanities in the early years of their education. And if I'm wrong, Neha, you can tell me.
All right, other questions? Oh, here, I'll give you the microphone.
My question's kind of short. How many years do you give it before P versus NP is solved?
How many years until P versus...
You
Don't you want to know
what
if it's ever going to be solved?
Do you want to know what the answer is?
Yeah.
No? Well, I have an opinion, but well, I would do the following calculation. The conception of the problem occurred around 1970. So, and the completion of the analysis is unknown. So we'll make a sort of Bayesian choice to say that it's halfway through. However, it's also true that the size of the field is increasing, so there's more intensity. So I don't think it'll take 48 years. It'll be a little bit less. So my guess is that it'll take place sometime within the next 40 years or so. And what I'm pretty sure of is that it'll be done by somebody very young who hasn't been taught the basic concepts that are currently accepted in the theory of computation, but will have a completely different slant that nobody's thought of. So I say 40 years, and the outcome will be that P is different from NP.
Great question. Here.
So you mentioned that one of your colleagues said something about you going around just looking for problems.
Yeah.
So once that you've found your problem, what do you consider the most important part of the problem-solving process?
Problem solving or problem defining?
I think the question is, once you found the problem, once it's defined, what's the most important part of solving?
Well, in the context of the NP reductions, they weren't very difficult. They were really exercises. I mean, I think the whole edge that I had was that I had thought of doing these reductions. When it came down to doing them, in many cases they were easy. In one or two cases I got help from people like Bob Tarjan and Gene Lawler, but in general it wasn't a real tour de force to find these reductions. As the field has progressed, the number of NP-complete problems that have been recognized has become, well up in the thousands, and people more skillful than I have been doing the more difficult reductions. So, for example, I showed without much difficulty that computing the chromatic number of a graph, the number of colors needed to color a graph, is an NP-complete problem. Colleagues later on showed that even for the case of 3 colors, it's NP-complete. So they started going into more detailed classification, defining problems more strictly, and often then they would encounter technical difficulties. But nowadays, it's very difficult to get a paper who's published if its principal result is an NP completeness proof. It's become too easy.
Is that right? Yeah. So it's a thing that got you the Turing Award now is mundane, huh? Yeah, who cares? Okay. All right, other questions? Beresford. Okay.
Well, if I may, I'd like to make a comment.
Certainly.
Which arises from Dick's remarks. And this is a little bit of ancient history. Dick somewhat glossed over it, but the point is, when Berkeley had 2 computer science groups on campus, both recruiting, one was in the College of Letters and Science, and the other was in the College of Engineering. So it was really a struggle between colleges. That's at a high administrative level. Anyway, there was a young, new assistant professor in the mathematics department called Steve Cook. He just completed his dissertation at Harvard, and he came straight here, and he was a potential candidate for the new computer science group in the College of Letters and Science. I eventually became one of the first chair of it. But anyway, Steve was an interesting young man. He was quite self-confident and not over-industrious. And he knew he'd written a very good dissertation. And so he went through the process of being first-year assistant professor, which is pretty tough. You're teaching classes you've never taught before, and it takes a lot of time. And he and I used to play squash together a bit. I mean, very soon he would beat me, but it then came up after about 3 years that he had to be assessed for maybe promotion to tenure or let go. And the mathematics department, to its eternal shame, convened on this problem and said, well, this young man is very bright, but he's not published anything. And they voted not to give him tenure. And one of our colleagues, who hasn't been mentioned much in this, but Elwin Berlekamp, who's a very distinguished mathematician, among other things, and electrical engineer, he was absolutely furious. He knew the quality of Steve's work. And of course, the majority of the people in the mathematics department just didn't know anything about it. He was unknown, and he hadn't published in 3 or 4 years. And so Elwin Berlekamp did all he could, recruiting other more powerful members of the math department, but he couldn't change the vote. And so Steve Cook went to Toronto, and he could have been part of the Bay Area's, if only the mathematicians had had the wisdom to say, we can't judge this. This is outside our domain, so we'll postpone. But they didn't.
That's a great story. Okay, yeah, and so we were just debating whether Cook left in '69, I think, and his famous paper was published in '71, and so did he write? If he had written that, if the ideas came up at Berkeley, what?
Correct me if I'm wrong. It was all done.
Oh, I don't know. I never discussed that with Steve, but the question of when he completed that result. But I do completely agree that it was a blunder, and it rose from the orientation and emphasis of the math department, where theoretical computer science was definitely not recognized as an established area. It was a curiosity. And perhaps Belval can add to that. Yeah.
We're going to learn history here.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you see, I arrived in January the 1st of 1969. And because I used to work late nights, I'd wander around the halls. It was Campbell Hall at that time. And I would hear the way Steve dealt with students. And then I looked into some of what he had done. And I went to the then chairman of the math department, Addison, and I said, you've got a gem here. What's the story of his career path? And Addison said, well, it's too bad you weren't around in September, because that's when we voted not to grant him tenure. And then I tried to get, I had a position both in math and computer science. And so I went to my friends in computer science, and some of them certainly knew Steve well enough to agree. Certainly you did, and Mike Harrison did. And Berlekamp wasn't all that active then in the computer science department. But we couldn't get the dean to agree to transfer Steve Cook to computer science, where an appreciation of his work would have been somewhat easier. He had done the work. Writing the paper took a while, and then the referees took a while. And so the fact that it appeared in '71 doesn't alter the fact that his ideas were formed very nearly while he was here in Berkeley. But in any event, when we failed to get him transferred to computer science, I had come here from Toronto, and I was friendly with the chairman of the computer science department in Toronto, and so I called him up. I said, Tom, we're about to make a disastrous mistake from which you can profit. And so he invited Steve up to Toronto, and Steve was a little bit reluctant. I mean, Toronto is sort of far away, but Toronto is on Lake Ontario, and Steve likes sailing. And so with one thing and another, that's the position he accepted, and he's been there since. Yes, what we did was stupid.
Yeah, I would say that the fact that we're discussing that blunder 45 years later is a greater distinction
Yes.
than getting tenure at Berkeley.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Carla would like another lunch, so you know what? I will ask. I will ask him. I'll send him email, and I will say, I have an unusual question. It appears I've made an omission. I'll let you know. I don't think this is a high probability, but I'll ask. Okay. Other questions.
Well, in the winter, he might enjoy coming.
Yes. Wait till January and ask him to come. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I think we're going to declare victory. Well, thanks very much for doing this, Dick.
Thank you very much.
That was great. That was great.